Tonight we are privileged to have Matthew Grow, who is the Director of Publications for the LDS Church History Department. He's also one of the general editors of the Joseph Smith papers. And you've all, if you've been to any of these before where the Joseph Smith papers have come up in any way, you will know that we are huge proponents of the Joseph Smith papers here at Benchmark Books, and feel that this series and these publications are amongst the most important items to ever be in print from our church, and the impact that they're having and will have in the future is enormous. And you know, Matt, I don't think that's an understatement. I think many really fail to realize just how important the Joseph Smith papers are, and the ground that they've plowed and the ground that they prepared for scholarship. Some of the scholars that are coming up through those ranks today are amazing. And one of the things that I'm excited about is to have one of the newer generation scholars with us, Matt Grow. And this is no comment on age at all, Ron. But we have one of the great historians of our time in the church, Ron Walker, who has, well, I was going to hold him up. One of the incredibly important, groundbreaking books we've had in the last generation is Massacre at Mountain Meadows, that Glenn Leonard, Rick Turley, and Ron Walker did. A tremendously important book, one that none of us would have guessed could be published in our lifetime if we'd been polled 50 years ago. He also did Wayward Saints, which is history of the Godbeites, another important book. Most people don't know anything about the Godbeites. I'm just sort of doing this, okay, I meant to hold up. Matt, of course, and I don't see the Parley P. Pratt, he did an award-winning biography of Thomas L. Kane, and yeah, hold that one up. So, and he did the Parley P. Pratt biography with Terrell Givens, another award-winning book. Both of them have won numerous awards from MHA and others. And it's funny, you know, did you ever think that because you did a biography of Thomas L. Kane, you might want to do his letters too? Did it ever?
Of course.
So that brings us to our book tonight, The Prophet and the Reformer, Correspondence between Brigham Young and Thomas L. Kane. You know, and I'm really pleased to see this many people here. We were just sort of saying beforehand, Matt and I were talking, and I say, you know, we never know how many people are going to come. We don't do RSVP or anything, and I thought, well, you know, it's letters, and will there be as many people that are interested in letters between two important individuals? So I think you've proven that is important. And I've just gotten my time signal from the boss, so I'm going to now turn the time over to Matt Grow. Please let's give him a big hand.
So do I need that? Yeah. Okay. I'll put that in my pocket. Let's try this. Let's see how that works.
All right.
Can you hear that?
Well, thanks a lot, Kurt. If I could take just a minute at the beginning to talk about the Joseph Smith papers and give you a sense of what's coming up, because I know this is a crowd that loves books. I think we're entering the next 18 months on the Joseph Smith papers, and the Church Historians Press is a really exciting time. On August 4th, we'll release the printer's manuscript of the Book of Mormon. It will be a large facsimile edition. On one side, the images. On one side, the transcript, color-coded by the scribe who wrote. The printer's manuscript is long enough that it takes 2 physical books to do that, but they're absolutely beautiful books, so we're really excited about that. And then in November, we'll have the 3rd volume of Joseph Smith's journals, the last 18 months of his life. Just really exciting material. And then in March 2016, we'll have our first book that's not in the Joseph Smith Papers that is published by the Church Historians Press. And it's a book of Relief Society history. From 1842 to 1892, it's a documentary history like the Joseph Smith Papers. It will include the Nauvoo Minutes of the Female Relief Society, really foundational to the history of the Relief Society, and then about 80 other documents through the first 50 years of Relief Society. That spring, we will also publish the 4th volume in the document series, 1834 and thereabouts. And then next fall, we will publish the Council of 50 Minutes from 1844 to 1846. So really just a number of volumes that we think are groundbreaking, exciting, and it's going to be fun 18 months. I think one thing I've done really well in my career is choose collaborators. And it's just been a thrill for me to work with Ron Walker. Some years ago, as I thought about who the sorts of people that I'd want to collaborate with, Ron Walker was at the top of that list. I don't think there's any better written book. Whoa, what's going on? Any better written book in Mormon history than Wayward Saints, the Godbeites. If you haven't read it, it's just a beautiful book. It's about 5 years ago, I think, that we started on this project. Ron had thought about doing a book on the letters of Thomas Kane and Brigham Young for a long time, and we decided that if I brought my Kane research and he brought his Young files, we'd have a pretty good research base to start with. Of course, my Kane research is a couple of file drawers, and Ron's Young research is 2 or 3 rooms worth. So it's just been a lot of fun for me to work with Ron. We're each going to talk for about 15 minutes or so, and I'm going to share some information from the introduction to the book to try to give you a sense of what it is, and then Ron's going to share some information from later on in the book. And I'll do a little bit of reading up front, then I'll just talk the rest of it through. On July 11, 1846, a 24-year-old Philadelphian arrived in a refugee camp in western Iowa to visit the Mormons who had been expelled that year from Illinois. The unlikely visitor, Thomas L. Kane, had not stumbled upon the Mormon camps by chance. 2 months earlier, he had met Jesse C. Little, an agent dispatched by Mormon leader Brigham Young to lobby for government support for the Latter-day Saints. An aspiring social reformer, Kane believed that a relationship with the Mormons could be mutually advantageous. He thought that a book recounting their woes would help their cause and establish his reputation as a humanitarian. He further dreamed that accompanying the Mormons to California, where he thought they were headed, would open political doors for him, possibly even including the governorship of the territory once California entered the United States. As he confided to a brother, he hoped to help the poor Mormons to my utmost principally, but also to help myself if I see anything outstanding. There may have been something else that also prompted his visit. Kane would later claim to have been part of a little state secret, known only to a handful of men, perhaps a role in President James Polk's schemes to expand American borders. 6 weeks prior to his arrival in the Mormon camps, Kane had drawn upon his father's political connections to assist Jesse Little in persuading President Polk to commission a regiment of Mormon soldiers for the Mexican-American War. An army officer who had arrived in the makeshift Mormon settlements a few days before Kane had encountered substantial opposition in convincing Mormons to enlist. Most Mormons envisioned a plot to further weaken and perhaps destroy their community. Brigham Young realized that Little's mission had succeeded and saw opportunity where most of his co-religionists sniffed a conspiracy. Kane's confirmation of Polk's decision to raise the Mormon troops, along with Young's preaching, dispelled the rumors about the government's intentions, and 500 Mormons soon enlisted. Intrigued by Kane, Young at their first meeting discussed with him the state of the nations, and told him the time would come when the saints would support the government of the U.S., or it would crumble to atoms. Whatever the religious skeptic Kane thought of Young's apocalyptic rhetoric, he was impressed by the Mormons' sincerity and concerned about their long-term prospects for peaceful coexistence with the United States. Encouraged by Young, Kane began to envision a permanent relationship with himself as the Mormon's self-appointed defender to the nation. Young recognized that Kane's talents and political connections would prove immensely useful in defending the Mormon cause in the halls of Congress and in the pages of Eastern newspapers. He cultivated a personal bond of friendship with Kane, which cemented Kane's decision to become the Saints' advocate. Young and Kane were a study in contrast. Born in 1801 in Vermont, Young was born into a family that had fallen on hard times. He recalled his father's great hopes. "My father was a poor, honest, hard-working man, and his mind seemingly stretched from east to west, from north to south, and to the day of death, he wanted to command worlds." The family moved often, but nothing seemed to change their hard-scrabble living. Young remembered that his father's discipline was as harsh as the surroundings. "A word and a blow," he said, but the blow came first. His mother, Abigail Howe, was softer. She died when Brigham was 14, worn out by the family's restless moving, 11 pregnancies, and a lingering illness called consumption, almost certainly tuberculosis. Abigail had always been a child of sorrow, recalled one family member. She may have had bouts with depression. As a child, Young tried to help his family get by, which meant there was not much time for school. He claimed only 11 days of schoolhouse learning. "When I meet ladies and gentlemen of high rank," he would later say, "they must not expect from me the same formal ceremony and etiquette that are observed among the great in the courts of kings." When Brigham was 16, his father placed him into an apprenticeship to learn the carpenter and joiner trade. The arrangement ended when John made another of his moves. After his father's remarriage, Brigham left the household to make his own way. For the next 18 years, he worked as a laborer and then as an artisan. He dug wells, painted houses, made furniture, did odd jobs, anything to make a living, and gained a reputation for hard work and skill. He also became known as a seeker of proper religion. At first, he avoided baptism into any church, but then, at the age of 23, joined the Primitive Methodists. About the same time, he married 18-year-old Miriam Works. They moved to a city called Mendon, New York, where he established a carpentry shop and rented land. The family lived upstairs, which allowed Brigham to watch Miriam in the last stages of consumption, the same dreaded tuberculosis that had killed his mother. Young may have inherited his mother's depression, or perhaps it was just because of his difficult life. He recalled of these times everything had a dreary aspect. "I hated the world and the things of the world, and the poor miserable devils that were governing it." He found relief in a new religion. For several years he'd been hearing rumors about Joseph Smith and a golden Bible. Then in 1830 he got a copy of it. Although Young read the book and was impressed, he hesitated. "Hold on," he remembered thinking, "wait a little while." A year and a half later, another set of missionaries came through, preaching religious wildfire, speaking in tongues, and saying that Christ's second coming would soon take place. He was soon baptized and took to the preaching circuit, baptizing converts and raising congregations. Soon he moved to the church's city of Kirtland, Ohio, and became, over time, one of Joseph Smith's most trusted confidants, and his successor in 1844. Contrast that with Kane. "Born, in his own words, with a gold spoon in my mouth, to station and influence and respectability. The son of a federal judge and political strategist, John Kane, who moved in the highest circles of the National Democratic Party." His mother, Jane Leeper, came from a prominent political family as well. They had 7 children. Kane's older brother, Elisha, would one day become internationally renowned as an Arctic explorer. After a semester of college and 2 voyages to Europe in the early 1840s, Kane's 23 years younger than Young, he embarked upon a career as a lawyer and judicial clerk for his father and as a freelance social reformer. He was into anti-slavery, the abolition of the death penalty, peace, women's rights, all the sort of movements that agitated America at that time. In 1853, he married Elizabeth Wood, and though he kept his distance from traditional Christianity, he eventually started going to church after his marriage to Elizabeth, who was quite devout. So they meet in the Mormon camps in 1846. And for the next 31 years, they have this correspondence. They're only in the same physical place on two more occasions. When Kane comes to Utah to mediate the Utah War in 1857, 1858, and when he comes to Utah in 1872 to 1873 at Brigham's invitation to spend the winter in St. George and recover his health that had been destroyed by the Civil War. Thomas's family never understood the relationship with Brigham. John, Kane, his father, worried that his influence is among minorities and always will be. Elizabeth resented the constant time and attention taken up by Mormon affairs. Although her views softened after she came to Utah in 1872. She recognized that Brigham Young was quite a leader, but she blamed him for leading the Mormons into plural marriage. She told the nephew after Thomas's death, "Vulgarly speaking, I couldn't abide him. I used to be reminded by him of a great sandy cat with his yellow-gray eyes. But he was just as kind and hospitable to me as he could be, but I loathed him." And indeed, they were in many ways an odd pair, Kane and Young, the pragmatic prophet and the quixotic reformer, the millenarian who spoke in tongues, the skeptic of organized religion, the Yankee from humble origins, and the aristocratic Pennsylvanian. And you can see this difference in their correspondence. Kane's sentences can be learned, polished, complex. Young's style is more direct, pulsates with energy. The book contains about 100 of their letters, all the letters that we have. The letters are mostly at the Church History Library and at BYU, although there's a few at Stanford and Yale and at other places. I was surprised when I was doing research at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania one day when I found a letter of Brigham Young in another collection. In the beginning months of the Civil War, Kane was the lieutenant colonel of a regiment. And he and the colonel of the regiment had a falling out, even though Kane had actually recruited him to be the colonel of this regiment. Kane had all sorts of accusations against this guy. He thought he was using his position for political benefit, and indeed he was soon elected to Congress. He thought that he was a poor military leader, and it ends up with Kane challenging Charles Biddle to a duel. Biddle was a little less hot-headed than Kane, and he declines the duel. But one of Kane's accusations was that Biddle was taking his mail. And when I was going through Biddle's, and I thought, who knows if these accusations are true? You know, does Kane know if he's taking his mail? Does he know of these other things? But when I was going through Biddle's papers, there was an original Brigham Young to Thomas Kane letter. So apparently, he was. What we've tried to do in the book is introduce each letter, have the transcript of the letter, and then have historical annotation to put it in its context. And I think what we learn from the book is how much of a national question what they called the Mormon question was in the 1800s. That this was a problem of national politics, of national culture, and you constantly see Brigham Young and Thomas Kane plotting strategy about anti-polygamy legislation. You see them plotting strategy about how to remake the Mormon's image to a more sympathetic image than it had been. You see them talking about the federal officials who had been assigned to Utah. And there's really sort of three eras to the correspondence. The first is after they become acquainted in the Mormon camps, 1846 to the mid-1850s. And the theme of that period is how do we take the image of the Latter-day Saints and transform it from these sort of religious fanatics to something that would be more sympathetic to Americans as a whole. And Thomas is quite successful at doing that for a time, but it sort of comes crashing down when the Mormons acknowledge the existence of plural marriage in 1852. The next sort of era of the correspondence is the 1850s, or culminating with the Utah War, and then the couple of years after the war. And there's a tremendous amount of correspondence in that period about these federal issues about the federal officials in Utah, about how the war should be resolved, or the threatened war should be resolved, and then how that resolution should be kept in place for the 2 years after the war until the United States gets distracted by the Civil War. They have very little correspondence during the 1860s, and then the third era is between about 1869 and 1877, Brigham Young's death. And this era, the agenda of this era, I think, is established when Kane comes to Utah in 1872. And it's apparent that they talk about a number of things that they then correspond about in the last years of their life. They have a lot of correspondence about Brigham Young's will. Thomas understood that if Brigham didn't have a very explicit will, that it was going to be a real mess. It was unclear what property was Brigham's and what property was the church's. And then there was that matter of the heirs. There was sort of a lot of them, right? And so figuring out those issues took Kane about a year of legal work to do. So there's a lot of correspondence about that. They talk about finding a place, a safe haven in Mexico. And Kane actually goes to Mexico in the 1870s to find a place where the Mormons can move in case federal persecution gets too intense in Utah. And then there's also a lot of correspondence in that era about anti-polygamy legislation that's been introduced in Congress and how you battle that. So we hope you enjoy the book, and I'll turn the time over to Ron.
An explanation of the cane. I was walking down some stairs last week to my office carrying some things, and I flopped. And with that, I sort of pulled the muscles in all my right leg, and I'm wobbly. However, I need to tell you that this cane has just earned me so much deference. People open the door for me, they smile at me, they greet me as an old timer, which I have now become, and I'm thinking of keeping the cane as a permanent part of my persona. Let me just say it's been a thrill to work on this book. It's been a thrill to work with Matt. Matt has a style that is a rare gift. It's like a piece of crystal. The sentences come out crisp and clear and beautiful, whereas I labor and turn every sentence with all kinds of care. And it's been a joy to work with him personally. He is certainly one of our very best historians, and just a personal delight to work with. And the book has been a thrill. I would argue the case that Thomas Kane was certainly among the most important members of the first generation, most important contributors to that first generation of Mormonism. I would say certainly within a half a dozen of the most important, and I'm talking about Heber Kimball, I'm talking about George Cannon. He had a profound influence upon that first generation, which I think we're only beginning to come to grips with. So this book is an attempt, along with Matt's wonderful biography, to make sense of this very unusual man. Along the way, we make some sense of Brigham Young. Thomas Kane called Brigham an eccentric genius. And I think that may be as close as you're going to get in 2 words to describe Brigham Young. He was utterly unbound by tradition. He was eccentric. And he walked that line that often men of extraordinary ability walk, that makes them extremely unusual. So you have this, as Matt said, this unusual combination. I thought for my presentation, I would read from the epilogue of the book. It's only 4 or 5 pages long, and I'm not sure I'll read it all. But the epilogue is an attempt to capture some of the themes of the larger manuscript, as well as carry this interpretation of who Thomas Kane and who Brigham Young were. During summer 1877, Kane was on a family holiday when a newsboy peddling an extra edition from a local newspaper at a railway station shouted something about Brigham Young. Kane hurried into the train's cars and bought a paper. He learned that Young had died the day before. When Kane arrived back to his home in western Pennsylvania, he found a telegram from the Mormon headquarters waiting for him. The telegram was dated 4:06 p.m., August 29th, 1877. 5 minutes after Young had died. He would be the first person told of the death. Kane decided to go to Salt Lake City, believing that his presence might be necessary. Elizabeth went with him as far as Erie, Pennsylvania, before Thomas headed off west by himself. At Chicago, he had second thoughts. Was he really needed in Salt Lake City? Another telegram from Salt Lake City assured him that he must come urgently. Church leaders were waiting for his arrival, quote, before doing anything. Like so many things involving Kane and the Mormons, the telegram was enigmatic. Was Kane needed to help choose Young's successor? Were the Mormons worried about Young's will that Kane had been so instrumental in writing? Or was there some other reason that the Latter-day Saints wanted him to continue his trip? As Kane continued on to Utah, he noticed 2 men suddenly appear in his Pullman car. They were Mormons who had been sent to ride with Kane to protect him. While earlier trains had been robbed, the most likely need for protection probably had to do with the rising tide of public opinion against the Mormons. Since the recent conviction and execution of John D. Lee for his role in the Mountain Meadows Massacre 20 years earlier, an outcry against the Mormons had swept over the land like a tidal wave. When President Young dies, persecution and emotion was at fever pitch. The torrent was so strong that the church's missionaries returned home, unable to proselyte. Young, who had a providential view of events, believed that the anti-Mormon feeling was related somehow to the recent dedication of the St. George Temple. The temple, the first built in the West, was an important spiritual milestone for the Mormons, and Young wondered if its dedication had unleashed a reaction by the forces of hell. Whatever the reason for the uproar, Kane knew that he might be in danger. He used an alias at the beginning of his trip, but then bodyguards, now with bodyguards protecting him, he gave up, quote, the ridiculous efforts to maintain incognito. He was too well known and too easily recognized for an alias to have done any good in the first place. Kane decided on two things. First, he would not accept any position that the Mormons might offer. Second, he wanted his trip to be short. He was going simply to, quote, render the last office of kindness to a dear friend. Although many Mormons knew that Kane was their friend, helping them at crucial moments, such as in the Utah War, few, not even many church leaders, understood his full role. And we might say that is true to the present time. Only Kane and perhaps Young really knew. Kane had helped defend and even shape Mormon policy for more than 30 years. This past service gave Kane reason to think that he might be offered some kind of position among them. Well, let me skip on a bit. He's met at Ogden by Wilford Woodruff, a longtime friend, but also interestingly, he is met by two sons of Brigham Young. He is met by John W. Young and by Brigham Young Jr. Once in Utah, Kane continued to jot details in his memo book. He used these books for record keeping in case he decided to write a history of his experiences. It is so too bad that we never got that history. He was always sort of putting it off, and his planned history of the Utah War he shelved because he thought it might be too embarrassing to government authorities. But his memo book was an important record of personality. He would just jot down a phrase or a sentence, and he hoped that these phrases could be reconstructed at a later time. Plus the fact he told Elizabeth, his wife, some of his experiences, and she filled in a broader account. One prominent subject was John W. Young, along with his high hopes and ambitions. Most recently, he had served as first counselor in the church presidency and had handled many of the church's day-to-day affairs during his father's final days. When Kane saw John at Ogden, the handsome 32-year-old looked pale and thin and greatly disturbed. He, John, I'm quoting Kane here, had supposed himself head and successor. John Young was not alone. Many outsiders thought that because of his verbal brilliance and his personal magnetism, he had charisma. He might succeed his father. And I think perhaps Brigham himself entertained these thoughts. However, when the quorum of the 12 apostles met 2 days after the funeral, it proclaimed itself to be Young's institutional successor, with John Taylor, the senior apostle, having the leading role. John Young was given the nominal position as counselor to the 12. John may have hoped that this decision might be reversed, and he appeared to lobby Kane hard. In almost a frantic manner, he insisted that Kane spend his first night in Salt Lake City at the White House. This was the old family home just east of the Temple Square, what is now Temple Square. But John seemed without comfort. According to Kane's account, he kept coming in and out of my room to look at me as I lay abed, to say that he would not disturb me, that he wanted me to rest, wanted to assure me that he just wanted to honor his friend and benefactor. But he was full of troubles and feelings, could not resist pouring out his turmoil. Well, one thing that Kane does do in this short period that he's in Salt Lake City is he visits the various households of Brigham Young. And during his life, President Young had this, well, it was more than a fetish, about concealing the affairs of his family. This was just a closed door, and he permitted few people to see his family or how they interacted. However, Brigham was now dead, and Kane had entree. He visited Mary Ann Young. "I am not one of those who mourn without hope," said Mary Ann Angel, whom Kane identified as Madame Mare. She was Kane's wife before he became, or she was Young's wife before he began the practice of plural marriage. And she was John W.'s mother. "I have had with him 44 years, she said, during which my life has been enlarged by his life and by the consciousness that every breath he drew was for the Lord and for the advancement of his kingdom. And I am comforted to think that he is now withdrawn from the persecution in preparation for him. They, his tormentors, would have tried his old age. He despised them. But he said, let them do their worst. But in age and sickness, it is hard to have to ask, will it ever stop?" Kane went to the Lion House, and he passed one of the rooms of the wives, and he heard a murmur. Perhaps this was Amelia Folsom. When Kane later visited her, he found her fashionably fitted in a morning dress and looking pretty, but so bloodless that you could almost see through her pale face. Kane tried to comfort her, but she told him that she had lost her prophet, her priest, her father, and her baby. Those are telling words. She was in her middle 20s when Young married her, when he was in his middle 60s. Well, let me just finish by giving you an image here. Sometime during the week that Kane spent in Salt Lake City, he walked up the hill on present-day A Avenue to pay his respects at Young's grave. It was located a short distance from the White House and had a commanding view of the city. Young had left instructions that the vault should be built like a fortress, and it had been. They wanted no disturbance of the grave. As Young was visiting the site, he met William C. Staines, an early convert to the church from England and a man of wide-ranging interests. He had once owned the best residence in the city, which eventually became known as the Devereux Mansion. Staines had met Kane many times and had served as one of the confidential couriers between Kane and Young. In 1860, Kane had written a letter of an introduction for Staines to U.S. Attorney General Jeremiah Black, which described Staines as, quote, an honorable and excellent fellow, but not an Adonis. Staines was a hunchback. Kane saw an irony. What an odious contrast to the women at Christ's sepulchre, he wrote, comparing Staines and himself to the women who had visited Jesus' tomb on Resurrection Sunday. He knew that age and illness and battlefield wounds had disfigured him too. Then Kane jots down a phrase in his memo book. It was not in either of us, he said. These last words may have been about the men's lack of physical strength as they wobbled up the hill. Or perhaps Kane was referring to their suppressed emotions. Yet there may have been still another explanation. Although each man had known the Mormon leader for more than 30 years, it was not easy to explain him. He may have been a riddle to them, even to his death. Thank you very much. I think we have time for questions, and Matt, please join me, and if you have any comment or thought or query, we'll be glad to entertain them. Yes, please.
I have a question for Matt. You mentioned that Kane and Brigham Young talked about the problem with polygamy and the prosecution from the federal government.
Right.
I wonder if in the letters anything was mentioned about maybe strategically replacing the Articles on Marriage with D&C 132, if that was discussed at all in the letters.
No. So the strategy is all about politics. It's not about sort of internal church decisions. The closest they get to talking about that is Kane apparently has heard rumors in the 1870s when Young is under house arrest that the Mormons may duplicitously say that they have stopped practicing polygamy when they have, and he advises them that such should not be the case, right? I mean, that they need to be upfront about it. But they never engage in sort of discussions about Mormon scripture or things like that. Early on, I guess one discussion they do have about Mormon scripture is in 1850, Young has he has a number of gold rings made to give to people who have helped him defend the Mormons. And this is gold that the Mormons have mined in California, and it gets sent to Kane. He gives a ring, for instance, to Horace Greeley, the newspaper man, and others. And he has 3 rings made for the first presidency. Brigham Young's ring is in the Church History Museum in the Brigham Young sort of exhibit. And on each of the rings he inscribes a phrase from the Book of Mormon that he feels like describe Brigham Young or Heber C. Kimball or Willard Richards. So which is fascinating. It's sort of the only indication that Young has, or that Kane has sort of looked at Mormon scripture.
Let me just tag along there. there was a boundary there between Young and Kane about religion. After the Utah War had wound down, Brigham tried to approach him about religion and tried to interest him in Mormonism. And that was clearly beyond the pale. Kane admired the Mormons for their social improvement, for their attempts at a radical reconstruction of society. But religious matters were off limits.
You know, you mentioned that Kane, when he was coming to Brigham Young's funeral, was wondering that they were going to give him some kind of a position.
Yeah.
Was there any grounds for this? Was there a movement in the church to offer him a position, or is this something that he just fantasized about?
Probably the latter. I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I don't think Mormon leaders saw him in any way to be involved in matters of leadership. But it's certainly interesting, fascinating, intriguing that Kane thought that this might be so.
When you wrote the biography, did you find anything?
You know, there is sort of precedent, not for an ecclesiastical position, but he is offered a position as Utah's first governor before Brigham is offered it. He's offered a position as a senator if Utah becomes a state. Brigham Young offers him business positions, invites him to be the Utah delegate to Congress, invites him to be his personal business agent, invites him to do other business dealings. And Kane always turns them down and says, I can do more for you if I'm not officially connected with you in any sort of political or business dealings. There is sort of one enigmatic moment in 1873 when John W. Young comes to Kane, Pennsylvania, and we don't have any correspondence. Later in the relationship, they communicate as much through trusted couriers, messengers, as they do through letters. But Elizabeth Kane writes in her journal that Thomas has withstood a temptation today. The Mormons have offered him a position that he's turned down. And it's unclear what they're offering. She doesn't sort of explain what they're offering him. I mean, Kane could have felt like, oh, maybe there is some sort of political or business or leadership position. Elizabeth is glad that she's turned him down, but she also says maybe Thomas could have sort of turned him around too if he'd accepted whatever was being offered. So who knows?
Well, he was kind of an eccentric himself,
Yeah.
And he probably entertained a lot of fantasy.
Right.
Did you find that when you were researching?
Yeah, you know, he's an interesting guy. There's sort of a period of time after the Civil War. Well, he has an interesting relationship with his wife Elizabeth. She's 16 when they get married, and he's 31. And initially, you can sort of see, you know, that he's making most of the decisions, and then that sort of changes over time. But after the Civil War, there's this period of time where he comes to her with all sorts of proposals. His brother Elisha, the art explorer, is dead 12 years by this point, and Elisha had argued that there was a warm sea at the North Pole, a sort of warm polar sea. And Thomas came to Elizabeth one day and said, you know, I'd like to go to the North Pole and prove his theories. And then he said, you know, I'd like to go to Central America and join kind of a filibustering expedition. Or maybe we should go to Canada and participate in a revolt there. Or maybe I could become governor of Washington Territory. Or maybe I could become governor of Utah Territory. Elizabeth's just kind of like, what are you talking about? Right? But they do pursue, some of them, they do sort of pursue the idea of becoming governor of a Western Territory for some period of time. But yeah, I mean, he does sort of have these flights of fancy at times.
Both men were eccentrics.
Yeah.
Both men were eccentrics.
Go ahead.
And maybe that was one of the things that bound them together.
Yes, this question I'll direct to you, Matt. You know, to help me get a handle on the character of Thomas Kane,
Yeah.
could we describe him as possibly a man worthy of admiration, or should we maybe view him as an opportunist, or simply as legal counsel to the church?
Yeah.
Can you repeat that?
So the question is, how would you view the character of Thomas Kane? Would you say he's an opportunist? Would you say, you know, he's just kind of legal counsel to the church? Would you say he's someone worthy of admiration? I think it's the latter. You know, I think there's this, you know, he does have this genuine sort of humanitarian streak that governs a lot of his actions, and certainly there's moments of opportunism, but you don't get much from defending the Mormons in the 19th century, right? I mean, I wouldn't see him as an opportunist in that sense. He also saw himself deeply as a man of honor, and he kind of lived by sort of a 19th century code of honor and what that meant. Thanks. So you know, I did come to admire him quite a bit in writing the book and in seeing him, not just kind of in those roles of a legal counsel or kind of a PR guy in the East or lobbyist, but I think there is this kind of genuine humanitarian side to him.
Let me just tag on that. Here is a man of extraordinarily poor health who didn't think he would get out of his adolescence, and no one expected him to live. He ended up outliving Brigham, of course. But there are moments in his career of heroic physical endeavor beyond the limits of ordinary individuals, where he is caught in a blizzard, and he pushes through. This is a man of adventure, much to admire in his life.
Go ahead, Gary.
How did the other brethren view Kane both before and after Brigham Young's death? What was their opinion of him?
Oh, I think they thought very highly of him.
Repeat it.
So the question is, what did the other church leaders think of Thomas Kane? So before Brigham's death, there's a moment in the School of the Prophets in the early 1870s, I think, where they're sort of discussing national affairs, and Joseph F. Smith basically says, you know, that only Thomas Kane can sort of be admired among that great mass of Gentiles, right? So I mean, I think they do see him very positively. The other person he collaborates with very closely is George Buchanan, because Cannon does so much in terms of politics and other things. So he becomes, after Young's death, Kane's closest associate within the church hierarchy, and they maintain an active correspondence as well. But he works with a lot of church leaders, works with John Taylor and others. There's kind of an interesting moment after he's in the Mormon camps in 1846. He writes to his parents, who have this Philadelphia mansion, and says, I've told all these Mormon leaders that they can come and visit us at home. And he said, you know, if Orson Hyde or Orson Spencer come, get out the fine china, they're really distinguished, we need to treat them well. Jesse C. Little comes, and Jesse Little's actually an ancestor of mine, and he says, if Jesse C. Little comes, send out Pat, who's the younger brother, to meet with them. Don't let him stay for dinner. Right? So I mean, there's obviously, you know, personalities and intentions involved, but overall, it's very positive. Yeah. Other questions? Please.
Are Kane's journals available, or where are they available?
Yeah. So Kane has an extensive collection of papers that are primarily housed at BYU. BYU, my understanding is it was sort of their largest documents purchase in the history of the special collections there. They acquired it in the 1980s and early 1990s and just did a marvelous job of organizing it and things like that. Kane himself doesn't have many journals. He has some pocket sort of notebooks and journals that are they're really difficult to make sense of. The handwriting's poor. There's this kind of stream of consciousness. But his wife Elizabeth kept fabulous journals. Really, really good journals. She has an amazing Civil War journal. She keeps journals throughout most of her life, long past Thomas's death, and she's the one who keeps his papers together. And she's 15 years younger than he is, and outlives him by 30 years, and really sees herself as the guardian of his papers, of his legacy, things like that. Any other questions?
We got one more.
Okay.
Let's make this the last
Yeah,
one.
we'll make this last.
I was just wondering if there was anything to the stories of him being baptized. Is there anything in any of the information you collected that would suggest that at all?
There's a couple of things that I would say about that. I just mentioned that Elizabeth saw herself as the keeper of Tom's legacy. And in 1905, thereabouts, there was a minister who wrote an article that said Thomas Kane was baptized a member of the LDS Church. And nothing upset Elizabeth more. There's just a fabulous letter where she just takes this guy to task. But what she does say is that the rumors about this may have begun because the Mormons, when Thomas Kane becomes ill in their camps in 1846, put him in a hollowed out log in the river and do something. And it's possible that, either they're sort of cooling him down from the fevers, or it's possible they see this as kind of a baptism for health that they're practicing in that time. But certainly they wouldn't have seen it sort of as a baptism to enter the church, because apparently he's unconscious at the time, right? I mean, there's no consent or that sort of thing. There's these rumors that dog Kane throughout his life that he's become Mormon, and probably the best evidence that those rumors have no basis is that about a year after Thomas's death, his closest Mormon associate goes to the temple and gets baptized by proxy. So George Buchanan does that within about a year. And if anyone would have known if Kane was a secret Mormon, it would have been George Buchanan.
Just another tag on this. He receives 2 patriarchal blessings. Usually these are reserved for baptized members of the church, and they are very unusual. The first is given to him by Uncle John Smith in the plains of western Iowa, where he is promised a fullness of priesthood authority during his life. Make sense out of that? I can't. Thank you very much. We so enjoyed being here.